My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. We are thrilled to have with us tonight Dr. Lindsey Cormack, who's going to be talking to you about how to raise a citizen. Take it away, Dr. Cormack.
Thank you so much, Sarlene and Bev, for setting this up. I'm excited to do this talk with you all, and thank you all for participating. When you want to put your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, I'll get to them, and then we're going to do them at the end. But for now, let's get started with the presentation. First, I want to tell you a little bit about who I am, because I realize for most of you, we haven't yet met. This is the weirdest part of me. For a year, I had a sabbatical, and I was able to do something that I thought I never would be able to do, but I was able to sit in different parts of New York City with this little sandwich sign that I made that says, "Will you chat with me about politics for 3 minutes?" And I had a 3-minute sand timer. And one of the reasons I like doing that during my sabbatical was in my daily life, I do a lot of studying about politics, but it's usually about numbers or text as data. And this allowed me to talk to people one-on-one, and it informed some of the things that went into the eventual book that I'm going to talk about later. Like Charlene said, I'm at Stevens Institute of Technology, which is a premier engineering school in Hoboken, New Jersey. And one of the reasons I was inspired to write this book in the first place is because I work with really brilliant students. They are so good at doing school, they are earnest learners, and they go on to great careers. But I found after being with them for the 6 years before I started to write this book that many of them don't know a lot about our government, don't know a lot about politics, don't know their own power. And so I thought, if some of the smartest kids in our country aren't getting these messages, then I imagine we have a lot of work to do thinking about everyone else who gets through high school and might not hear what they need to hear in order to fully participate in our democracy. The first thing I ever did as a professor, actually, I did this as a graduate student, but the first accomplishment in my sort of field was running DC Inbox, which I encourage you later to go see. It's a website that's good on a computer, not as good on a phone, but you can go see what your members of Congress are talking about. Right now, there's a lot of chatter about the shutdown, and you can type in any keyword and see who's saying what, how it's been over time, how it looks on a geographic map. There's just a lot of neat things that you can learn in that tool. The first book that I wrote was Congress and U.S. Veterans from the GI Bill to the VA Crisis. And I'm really grateful that I got to do that book. It was on the encouragement of a colleague who said, "Lindsey, I think you have something to say here." But the book that I'm going to talk to you about tonight, How to Raise a Citizen and Why It's Up to You to Do It, is my favorite project that I've ever done. And I'm so grateful that I get to share it with you. You'll see at the bottom that I put this little thing about Community Board 8, because it's not just that I talk the talk here. I do also walk the walk in some ways. For the last 3 years, I've been an appointed member of Community Board 8 in Manhattan, and I'm the chair of our Street Life Committee, which is tasked with overseeing liquor licenses granted here, cannabis licenses granted here, as well as our sidewalk cafes and roadway dining, which has been a really upfront look at how local government works, what constituencies demand, what businesses need, and how all these things come together. And for the last year or so, I've been on tour with this book. And so any question you have, I'm very open to hearing. Any feedback you have or pushback you have, I'm also open to hearing. Because one of the true gifts of doing this work is that I get to meet people that I otherwise wouldn't have met. And I get to hear perspectives that I otherwise might not have been exposed to. So please don't hold back. If you have questions or comments, I want to know them. Okay, let's get started. What you're seeing right here is a map of the United States, and all the different colors represent all the different ways that the states themselves have set up how we teach civics in K through 12. Now, there's never going to be a test where I say, like, what does this state do or that state do? But I put this map up to start to say that there is not one standardized curriculum around the United States about what kids need to learn about US government, politics, civics. Instead, we have 50 state systems, and within all of those states, many places devolve it to different counties or school boards or school districts. And then within all of those subdivisions, we have public schools and independent schools and religious schools and home schools. And it's all builds together to say that it's very hard to say exactly what our kids are learning, because our kids are not learning the same things across the country. Every state takes a different approach. And when we started to write this book, we thought we might be writing a book that was which state is doing a better or worse job in getting kids ready to participate in politics as soon as they turn 18 and they're eligible as voters. And what we found in the course of doing this work is that no state is doing it that well. And so instead of writing a book that just says, here's some curricular decisions you can make, it became a parenting book because we realized in the course of doing this work that if we want to make change, it's going to be very hard to get it done in schools. It's not a bad idea to try, but it's going to be easier, more effective, and faster if we can have these conversations within the confines of our homes, within the warmth of our own communities, and decide that we want to orient ourselves to civics, to politics, to government in a different way. What I'm showing you right here is the data from the nation's report card, which you probably hear about from time to time. At the beginning of this school year, there was this reports about how all of our math scores around the country had gone down. What you're looking at right here is the scores for civics that's tested in 8th grade for students from 1998 to 2022, which is the last time that we administered this test. The different bars are colored to say what would be the outcomes that would lead to different levels of competency. So that green bar would be what we consider an advanced achievement in civics. So the students really know their stuff, they have a civic orientation, they have dispositions that allow them to understand how to be an American and how to participate in politics. The yellow bar is a proficient achievement, and the red bar is a basic achievement. The blue bar is the test scores that we actually see throughout the United States. And though you might notice there's like a little bump up in between 2010 and then 2020, from 1998 until today, it's mostly stayed flat. Our children aren't learning more than some of the parents who were learning these things as high schoolers before they themselves became parents. And so we know that if we're looking at how we're doing this in 8th grade around the country, there's an indication that we're certainly not proficient, we're obviously not advanced, and we're really close to basic. But more troubling for me is that we're not showing any improvement. Our kids are not learning more. Our schools are having a hard time imparting these messages in a way that's reflected in the test scores of our 8th graders on how much they know. Another metric that we can think about is the advanced placement tests. So as parents, I'm sure you all have grappled with the idea of whether you're going to have a high schooler who takes an AP course or not. What you're seeing here is all the AP courses that were administered in a given year in 2019 and the average score around the country. Now, it's important to note that only 2% of American students will take AP US government. So this is a very small subsection, but it is the subsection that opts in, usually because they have some interest in American politics, or they think it's going to be an easy course, or they think it's going to be something that they can get out of the way, and then they might not have to take it in college. Whatever the reason, of those students who are opting into these classes, most of them do not earn college credit when they take this test, because what you're seeing in the bars here is the average score. And in order for a college to accept your AP test score as college credit, it has to be over a 3. US government and politics is routinely one of the lowest scoring tests, despite the fact that nearly every student who sits for this test is going to live the rest of their life as US citizens in America. This is something that's sort of troubling because we know that this is problematic in the high school realm, or at least it was in 2019. And if you look at even more recent data in 2023, if you're trying to scan this and look for where's American government, go all the way down to the bottom right. It's the 37th out of 38 tests administered in 2023 for the share of students who got a 3+, which means they were able to earn college credit provided that their colleges accepted that. Fewer than half of the students who sat for this test in AP US government were able to earn that score, which means that from 2019 to 2023, things got worse if we're looking at the high school scores. But this story gets a little complicated. So what you're seeing here is the overtime averages of the different tests. The grayed out ones are other things that aren't civics or government, like English, math, science, some languages. And then you're seeing AP US government and AP US history in those red and blue bars. And what you'll notice is that 2023, there's this little jump up inflection. And in 2024, the test scores get higher. When I present this data to young students, I go to middle schools and high schools and do these sorts of talks. I'll say, like, what do you think happened here? And people will give me different guesses. They'll be like, oh, well, maybe it was the election. Maybe everyone was paying attention. Maybe we taught it differently. But the answer is actually far worse. The answer is that due to pressure on AP for not doing tests that are getting kids college credits, they did what's known as a recalibration, which is they have essentially grade inflated away a true challenge that we have in that our students don't understand this material. And instead of saying, you know what, we're going to have to do something different in the schooling, like maybe layer it in different years, they've said, I think we're going to make the test assessment recalibrated so that more students can earn what is eligible for college credit. Now, this is a good time to pause and say, well, we don't know exactly what every student is getting. There's sort of a modal style of delivery of civics education in America. In most states, children are introduced to their first civics or social studies class in their 7th or 8th grade. Sometimes they'll learn something like world history. Sometimes they'll be Columbus sails the ocean blue. We're here, there's pioneers, there might be a little westward expansion, there's some talk about the founders, and that's usually what happens in 7th or 8th grade. And then the topic of government and civics lays pretty dormant until 11th or 12th grade when our students will get a class called government. And it depends on what state you're in. Sometimes a government class will be a year. Most often it's a semester. Then sometimes it's half a semester and it's bundled in with another course like economics or geography. But whatever the style is, we know that the modal form of delivery is a check-in in middle school and then a check-in at the end of high school. And I'm not sure what you were like in high school. I have a daughter who's entering high school, and I can recall what I was like in high school. And I'll tell you that in that 12th grade year, when I was thinking about what was happening next, whether that's going to be college, a relationship, a job, moving away from home, it wasn't, let me learn everything about government that I need to learn right now because I'm never going to get to take a class like this again. And so our style of delivery generally isn't serving our children well. Our test scores reflect it, and we've tried to sort of change the grading scheme to make it seem like that's not a problem. But I actually think that might make us worse in the long run because we're sort of masking something that we really need to address and get through. What you're seeing right here is a different form of data. So I've highlighted two bars, one to reflect the state that I'm in right now, which is New York, and one to reflect California, where I understand the majority of you might be. And what you're seeing here is the share of people who are 18 to 24, our youngest eligible voters, and their rates of registration across the US states. And you'll notice there's high variability. There's some states as low as 41% of those people who are eligible in that 18 to 24-year-old band being registered to vote. And then some states top out over 70. But in that variability, we also have an indication that the way that our schools are doing this really does depend on what the state curricula allow. I have a current research assistant who is doing a really interesting project looking at all the curricula across all the US states and checking off, does it teach them how to vote? Does it teach them how to do vote by mail? Does it teach them how to move registration? And I think we're going to have an exciting update for the book, but that's not today. That's something that will be coming in the future. But I do know that going down this path is what allowed that sort of research to happen in the first place by seeing all this different state variability. What I'm showing you here is the share of people who turn out to vote in 2024, so our last presidential election, by age. So in the bottom left, you're seeing 18-year-olds, and at the top or the bottom right, you're seeing 85 and over. And then you can see this is sort of a nice stair step upwards where people are essentially playing catch up in terms of how they can participate in politics from the time they're 18 to about 70, and then their power is really in force. When my college students get angry about the idea that people in federal politics are all what they'll say is really old, they'll see people in the Senate and the House or the presidency, and they'll be like, everyone's so old. And then we'll talk about what it is to live in a representative democracy. And they'll be like, well, let's go look at who's voting in the first place. Let's like see what we can find out there. And they'll invariably find some data and make a graph that looks like this. And they're like, oh, that's what's happening. Maybe it's that people are picking people that look like them. And they start thinking about what it is to be in power and how you have to be able to be represented by putting yourself forward by voting in the first place. Now, this graph might not look that dire. Sure, fewer than 50% of people in that under 24 age band are voting. But this is the high watermark in many ways because this is a presidential election. This is all eyes on, all news on, everyone's paying attention. You really can't avoid the coverage. What I'm going to show you next is from our last midterm election in 2022. So this is that same sort of data. It's the share of people turning out to vote by age 18 to 85 plus. The data is from the US Census, and fewer than a quarter of 18 and 19-year-olds who could have voted turned out to vote in the midterm elections. And this is something that if I were to show you this at state level elections or local elections, the steepness would be even greater and young people would be even more on the periphery. So we know by the data of our eighth graders, the data of our high schoolers, the registration and the voter turnout data of our 18 to 24-year-olds, that something's not quite working because we're not teaching people to be eligible to be able to vote by the time they're eligible to vote. So there's a few ways that we got there, and I'm going to go through them right now. The first is that American government is hard. It's intricate. There's a lot of steps. There's a lot of players. There's checks and balances. There's different levels. It's not something that's easy to grasp. It's not hard to grasp, but it does take time. And the way that we generally do this is one that doesn't provide our children with enough time to understand the very basic concepts to be order to make higher level thinking, in order to kind of see how things are working in concert or not in concert together, because it's very intricate. And if we only dip in seventh and eighth grade, and then maybe again in 11th and 12th, it's not surprising that when you first turn 18, you don't quite know how to put all the pieces together. In the research that we did for this book, we found that there's two sorts of orientations that happen in the United States that can be roughly mapped to geography. The tradition of not talking about politics kind of looks like it takes more place in the Midwest and the South, which might be because we have maybe norms of politeness. I myself grew up in Kansas, and I can say that this was certainly a feature in my household, which is we didn't talk about politics. And part of the rationale was it might make someone uncomfortable. You might say something that accidentally offends someone, or you're holding a value that's counter to theirs. And it sat in this sort of taboo place where, like, you wouldn't talk about sex or drugs or money or religion. And that tradition of not talking about politics doesn't serve us, and it really doesn't serve our children because they don't have the muscle memory when it's their turn to take the reins and be in power because they haven't practiced. So, not talking about politics is one way that we get into a civic deficit because there just isn't sort of that training ground for kids to look up to, practice, see other adults in their lives doing so that they can emulate and model. The other tradition that we saw, which was more on the coasts, was hating politics. And what I mean by that is an orientation that believes that government is always out to get you, that anyone who's serving in a political role is an egomaniac, a liar, in it for the wrong reasons, in it for themselves, and that sort of overtly negative, like lesser of two evils, or all politicians are corrupt. That sort of orientation to politics is a reason why children tune out and don't try to learn more. Because who wants to go learn about how to be a better liar or cheater or egomaniac? It's just not something that they want to do. And even in households that don't sort of practice this negative chatter around politics, children are exposed to these messages in their literature and their entertainment from a very early age. Think about cartoons that you might have watched or things that you've been exposed to since you've had children in your house. If there's a government character, it's usually the mayor, sort of like the apex of a city. And at best, that person is portrayed as someone who's like a bumbling doofus who like maybe gets it right by accident, but usually the protagonist of the story is the one who really got something done. But at worst, and often, the mayor is portrayed as someone who's out to do harm to the city that they're elected to protect. I see this in a show that my daughter is watching right now, and it's an older show, but this sort of orientation is pervasive in our entertainment. So that negative messaging that happens from our kids, whether or not it's coming from our own mouths, is in our houses because that's sort of what our entertainment culture has gravitated towards and taught them. I also make the argument in the book that school's out. And this is not an argument that says teachers are not good at doing this or that teachers aren't trying to do this, but there are a lot of reasons why it's really hard to do the work that we need to teach kids about civics in schools solely. Let's get into this detail more specifically. One of the first hurdles that we have is that state legislatures around the country in different capacities are sometimes constraining what can be said in a classroom or how you can approach civics in the first place. The example that I put up here from 2023 is an example from Texas, where some of the state schools were using things like action civics. And if you talk to someone who's in education and you ask them, like, how is it that kids could best learn civics? Most of them will tell you some variant of action civics, which is kids will get together, they'll find some sort of problem in their town or community, and then they'll have to go through the steps of what it would take to get that fixed. They're usually not successful, but in that process, they have to figure out, oh, is this a person who's responsible for this? Is it a committee? Is it a commission? Is this something that has to go to a ballot initiative? Is this something that we just have to get a legislative body on board to change? But in figuring out who pulls the levers or what the pathways are for changing something in their towns or their communities, students learn a lot. However, some states like Texas in this example have said that that's not going to be a permitted way to teach civics because they see it as overtly political because you might have to engage with someone who's appointed or elected and they didn't want school children doing this. That's only one example of how a legislature can change the way that we are oriented to teaching these things, but it is something that happens throughout the country in different ways. You also sometimes hear things about like how history curriculum are saying we can't talk about this, we're only going to use books that say this. And all of these things have this sort of chilling effect where teachers themselves aren't sure what they're allowed to say in the classroom or what they might do accidentally and fall into some sort of place where they're getting blowback from legislatures. There's also a challenge for test prep. And what I mean by that is when you think about the pinnacle of a high school career, it is the ACT or the SAT. And this is not to say that that's good or bad, but that is the reality about how children unlock college doors, how they unlock tuition dollars in the form of scholarships, how schools unlock prestige, whether they're known as blue ribbon schools, how teachers can sometimes pursue getting raises. It's about the preparation for the children who will end up taking the ACT and the SAT. And the challenge with these tests, as it is considered with civics, is that neither one of them has any civics or social studies components to them. The ACT did for a while, and then in 1987, it changed so that it could be comparable to the SAT. In the last few years, there has been a resurgence about saying that maybe in the reading comprehension portions of the SAT and ACT, we should have American documents, and we do see that in some of the tests. But the content of those things are never what's tested. And what we learned in interviewing teachers for this book, which we interviewed teachers in 47 states, they said if it's not tested, it's not taught, which is understandable. If you have a limited amount of time in the day and you have a very squeezed curriculum, if this one thing, civics, isn't going to be on that pinnacle achievement at the end of high school, it's not surprising that it gets squeezed out of what you're going to choose to talk about in your classroom. It's also the case that there's a series of court cases that we go through the book that have sort of changed the landscape for teachers for what they can say, what they can't say, what activities they can permit, what activities they cannot permit. And so that environment is just a little more fraught than in your home where there's not laws on how much you can talk about politics or what sorts of opinions you can share, how you can model listening. And so that's just a different environment in the classroom. When you think about the money on these things, it's very easy to see where we're putting our dollars and where we're putting our priorities. For every $50 the US federal government spends on K through 12 STEM education, so science, technology, engineering, math, they spend 5 cents on civics. Now, this has been true for a long time, and if we look at the dollars that go to schools for different subjects, since the 1950s, STEM has been on the rise, civics has been down. In terms of minutes in the classroom, civics gets the least amount of time and it gets the lowest amount of funding. Because there's no way to see it differently. However you slice it, we're just not prioritizing this from a spending perspective. There is some bright spot that's happening in the current administration in that the Department of Education made a series of grants to 40 organizations who are tasked with carrying out some sorts of civic education programs in the next year to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration. And so there is some change in federal monies, but for most of our history, it has been far under-resourced when compared to STEM. And then finally, and I realize that I'm saying this in an audience of people who are parents themselves, but one of the hardest things about why it's hard to get this done in schools is because parents are a part of that equation. And what I mean by that is sometimes you're going to see headlines where it's like parents are suing the schools because they're afraid or they allege that there's political indoctrination. And it might be something where in a liberal blue state, you're easy to say, like, oh, that's something that's happening somewhere else. But we see this even in New York City in our private schools where parents are unhappy about political content that might be in the classrooms. This is not to weigh in on like what's an appropriate way for a teacher to talk about politics, other than to say, parents have thoughts on this, and parents do make the job of teaching this in the classroom a little bit harder. I'm going to show you some new data that just came out from the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute of Civics Teachers. And they had a survey, and this is from this past year. And they were asking teachers, have you ever self-censored or avoided certain civics due to fear from pushback or controversy? And 76% of teachers said that they had. This squares away with what our research found for the book, which is teachers who know their stuff, who want to teach kids about civics, said that they were unwilling to wade into even very generic topics because they're afraid that a student's going to hear something, talk it through with their parents, something will get messed up in translation, and then there's going to be blowback. For instance, if a teacher says, you know what, I'm going to teach the separation of powers, and we're going to start with the Congress because that's Article 1 of the Constitution, it's the first branch. Then we'll move to the president because it's second, the judicial branch because it's third. If in that ordering, a student comes home and a parent hears like, well, they like the Congress more than they like the president, and they get upset about that, they could email the principal, they could inflame a Facebook group, they could badger the teacher directly by emailing them a lot. And so all of these things just make it really hard to get it done in the classroom, despite the fact that we have teachers who want to teach these things. What you're seeing on the right is from that same survey as to why teachers decided they weren't going to do things. It was fear of controversy, fear of pushback from parents and community, and then lack of time in the curriculum for them to get these things done. Everyone that we talked to in interviewing this book who was teaching social studies or government or AP US government told us a similar joke, which was, you know who teaches government? His or her name is Coach. And the joke that they're making is that in most places around the United States, teaching social studies is not a full-time job because we don't have enough classroom hours. And so usually in order to have a full-time capacity at a school, you're also the coach of the soccer team or the football team or wrestling or track or cheerleading. And so when we know that we have well-intended, good-oriented coaching people doing this class, but they're not able to do it in the way that they'd like, we have to think about other ways outside of that school box to get it done. And that's why I make the argument that parents should do some of this work. Parents can and they should be the agents of change. The first reason is very simple. Our children, they dream in the ways that we allow them to dream. If they never see us talking about politics, if they never see us caring about civics in our town, in our state, in our country, they're not going to understand that that's something that they should do or aspire to when they grow up. You all know that the kids in your life are sponges and they're soaking up your actions, they're soaking up your orientations, they're soaking up your activities because they want to model us and it's how they're made. So we need to be able to show them how to do this. I also know that children are very capable at doing politics. If you have kids who are ever fighting over a toy or trying to make up a game or on a playground, you know they can do politics. They're also really curious about this. Sometimes I'll hear like, well, young people don't participate in politics because they just don't care. There is a nationwide survey that's done by the Harvard Kennedy School every year, and over 70% of our youngest voters will always say they're interested in doing this. They just don't know how. And so it's not a lack of interest in this subject. It's oftentimes a lack of capacity to continue in it because no one taught them how to do the formal things like registering to vote or actually voting. I also know that no matter who you are, you will not like playing a game as much if you don't know the rules to it as if you do, whether that's a board game, a card game, or the game of politics. Things are more fun when you understand the playing field. And so if we're keeping our kids off of the playing field and not even telling them the rules when they can step onto the field, it's no wonder that they can't participate as well because they simply don't understand what they're doing. I also know that things can only get better with attention. And what I mean by that is this. When I was doing that experiment, when I was talking to people in New York City about what they're thinking about on politics, I oftentimes heard people saying things like, well, I don't really like where our politics are going, or it doesn't feel fun, or it's not really functional. And people would sort of see themselves as this like passenger on a ship of politics or passenger on this ship of American democracy. And with the attention to realize that we are not passengers, we are crew members, and we get to steer this ship wherever we want it to go, things can only get better. Things can only get calmer. Things can only get smoother. But we have to be willing to step up and take action there instead of thinking that someone else is going to do the work for us. I also know from all the parents that I've been able to talk to in doing this work and in other things that everyone wants their kids to be as powerful as possible. One of the ways that you give your kids a leg up in that power is by letting them know how they can exercise their own. What are the routes to power? Who's responsible for what in your town, in your state, at the federal level? How are these interconnected? All of that helps piece our kids together a more powerful life. We also want them to be healthy. And when we think about the things that plague our youngest people, our 18 to 24-year-olds, when they're going to college or leaving the home and starting a life out on their own, oftentimes it's things like depression or anxiety or anomie, or they're just not understanding their worlds. If we want them to be more mentally healthy, especially around politics, we have to give them the tools to understand it instead of be threatened by it. It's much easier to succumb to doom scrolling or hearing really outrageous things online if you don't know the basics. If you do know the basics, it's easier to read a headline and not have a knee-jerk reaction of fear, but instead have some sort of suspect approach to it to be like, I'm not sure if that's how that's supposed to go, or I'm not sure if that's actually a power that this person has. By giving people the agency, our children the agency to understand their politics, we make them healthier and more mentally resilient. I also know that we all want our kids to be successful. And I'm telling you from this side of college to the other side, if your children have participated, whether that's as an intern in a political office or on a campaign or in some sort of local government capacity, all of these things are net positive for college applications. If you have a child who works into these fields or volunteers in these ways, it shows that they're pro-social, it shows that they're problem solvers, it shows that they give back, it shows that they care about people. These are things that colleges want. If they're working with local elected officials, all colleges like to have students who understand what that sort of retail on the ground politics is, because those are students who are going to be on student government, who are going to things makes better for campus life. If you have kids who are into state government, that's great. When we think about the quality of life issues that many of our college students point to, whether that be access to reproductive health care, gun rights, drug legalization, those are state political questions. And so it's helpful to have students who care about that. And if you have a student or a child who's done something with a federal politician, that's even better because that's a connection that a college might not have previously had, where then they have that relationship where they might be able to place someone in internships in the future or course credits for internships in the future. So all of these things are really positive when you're looking at it on the admission side for what it signals about your student and for the value for a prospective college. So wanting your kids to be powerful, healthy, and successful are all great reasons to make sure that you talk to them about politics and make sure that they understand what they need to know before they leave your house so that they can hit the ground running. And finally, we benefit. Parents having conversations with their children about politics is one of the best ways to sort of reflect on your own perspectives, your own opinions, your own strongly held beliefs, because kids come about this in such a different way. They're not as prejudicial. They don't have these ideas in their heads that they're really clinging to. And instead, we can grapple with things more freely with our kids because we're not having to defend something to someone else. We're just trying to figure out and perspective share with each other. And so it's practice that's good for them, but we also benefit. Civil discourse really matters, and it's something that we have to show our kids, not just say it matters. Right now, in the spaces that I occupy, I keep seeing things like we have to turn down the temperature or the tone has to change. Everyone's got to do a better job. And by everyone, that doesn't mean some big national collective conversation. It's all the small individual conversations that build up the cacophony of what we are as American citizens. We have to do this in our homes, in our communities, while we're sitting on the sidelines of soccer, whatever it is, we have to show our kids what it is to do this work. I write that democracy depends on our ability to talk across differences, but what I also mean is that not only do we need to be able to talk across our differences, we need to be able to listen across our differences. We do not need our kids to see the world in the same way we do. We don't need our spouses to see the world in the same way we do, or our friends, or our neighbors, or our employers, or our employees. But we do need to have an ability to talk and listen to one another. We don't have to be convinced. We don't have to do the work of convincing someone else. But if we can't share perspectives back and forth, it's going to be very hard for democracy that is the result of iterations and collaborations on ideas to continue to function. We also have to be more willing to learn. And what I mean by this is it's not enough to just say, I feel this and therefore it is. When I talk to my students about how they've heard about something or what they think about something or how they're feeling about something, the last question I like to leave them with is what more would you have to learn about? Or what more would you like to know to have a more well rounded perspective? We have to do learning. In most of the country right now, there is some form of a local or state election contest happening in the course of this next year, despite the fact that it's off cycle for federal elections. We have to show our kids that when we're confronted with a bunch of ballot questions that we've never considered, what it is to go research and think about them. Because if we don't do that with them and we don't show them how to learn, they're not going to get that message and they won't develop it until much later in life, as you saw in our charts and how people participate in politics. We also know that our kids learn a lot from us in what we're modeling in our activities, in our discourse, than what they're going to learn from textbooks. Sometimes I'll get questions from parents who will be like, well, is there a book you can suggest for my kids where they're just going to learn this all? And there's plenty of good books out there. We're actually awash in information, but that's not the point. The point is they need to see the people in their life that they care about doing that work as well, instead of saying they can study it on their own and figure it out, because they learn a lot more from what we model. And by what we model, what I mean is you don't need to be a government trivia expert. No one needs to be a government trivia expert. I do this for a living, and there's plenty of stuff that stumps me. But what we need to model is curiosity and not certainty. We need to say, ooh, I haven't heard about that, or oh, I haven't thought about that, or hey, why don't we spend 10 minutes going and looking up stuff, sending them out, doing it yourselves, and coming back together. It's also important that we understand that disagreement is regular, normal, appropriate, and acceptable. But disagreement doesn't have to be yelling, shouting. Disagreement can be listening, lobbying, hearing, and then saying, like, okay, I guess we're not going to see this issue the same. Or maybe there are some points that we agree on, some that we don't. That's okay. Disagreement is a normal part of life, and political disagreement is one that we have to do better at working on in our own households. One of the reasons that I know actually that this is very important is when we talk about polarization as a political affliction of the modern America, I know that civil discourse is the only antidote to polarization. Having discussions where you can talk and listen and perspective share and not feel like you're under attack or you have to be right is the way that temperatures get taken down. It is the way that the polls become the less loud voices because everything's filled out in the middle. It's not an abstract concept to have civil discourse. It is a practice. It's not always comfortable. It's not always natural. It's not always what we've rehearsed. And many of us were raised in systems that were already actively deprioritizing civics. So we have to do that work. I also don't want you to feel like you can't make mistakes, because you will make mistakes, and those are teaching moments. Right now in my town, we have 6 ballot initiatives or ballot questions that have come up, and I don't know anything about them. I read them all through once and I said to myself, okay, here's where I think I'm going to land on this. And then I went out to a bunch of my friends who have thought about this in different ways, and I said, here's where I'm at, happy to have a conversation. And there was one where I sort of misread how it was written, and I didn't quite understand it in a way where I was like, oh, now that you've explained it, I think I might see this differently. You can use those mistakes as teaching moments. We don't have to be right in politics. We have to be flexible. And so if we can find those moments for ourselves, then our kids know that it's not as high stakes as always getting it right. It's just something that we can continue to pursue to make a more perfect union by having a more perfect understanding, by leaning into that learning. So how do we do this? I think that one of the best things you can do is what I just said, which is model curiosity, not certainty, learning, not always knowing. I use 4 questions and I go through this in the book. I ask first, what have you heard about something? And I do this in the classroom setting and in my home, because asking someone what they've heard is not asking them to defend a viewpoint or to justify their opinion. It's just, what have you heard? Could be, I saw this online. It could be someone said this in the classroom, could be on TV. That's the first question. I like to set the table with this. Then you can move into what do you think? What do you know? What do you want to know? And in chapter 4, I go through how all those conversations can play out in your own home. I also think it's really important that we have a shared American identity and we separate ideas from identity. And what I mean by that is if there's an idea that you find to be problematic, that idea can be divorced from the person who shares that idea. You can say like, "Ooh, that part might be problematic, but it's not the person that's problematic." I also make the argument that instead of saying politics is always compromise, politics is actually collaboration, or effective politics is collaboration. So sometimes when we teach this, we'll say, like, you're going to get a little bit and you're going to get a little bit, but no one's going to get exactly what they want. Everyone's going to have to make a little compromise. But the way that I teach this is that you want something, I want something, those things are different. How can we supercharge those things together into some collaborative outcome so that it's maybe even better than we thought going into it? That's what real politics can look like. It doesn't have to be bludgeoning force. It can be a sharpening tool. I also know that, and I keep repeating this to you all, but you have to be willing to learn. You have to be willing to do it. I know that people who are on this Zoom call are ready to learn because you're at your own free will on a weeknight getting on the computer to hear someone you don't know talk about these things. So you're already in that vein. If we want our politics to keep going, you got to do a little bit more. And then you act, which is taking your kids to vote with you, which is having conversations with them, which is showing them what it means to put all this together so that they can develop their own agency. What you're seeing right here is a sticker from the Hudson Valley, which is where I spend my summers, where they said to their middle schoolers, why don't you guys create what sort of sticker you're going to use for our I voted things? And this is the one that they came up with. And I'm really glad that they did because it shows that kids have the ability to do these things. They just need the opportunities to show us how it works. So how do we do this work? You have to be willing. Number one, be willing, step in, say that you'll do it, know that you don't have to get it all right, but accept it as a task for you to take on. Number two, show them. Take your kids to vote with you. Take them to meet elected officials. Take them to meet kids or candidates who are doing debates. If you're having town meetings or if you're having community meetings, show your kids who those people are. They might not find it to be interesting, but it does two things. It shows them that the people who are doing these work are just people. They're not nameless, faceless bureaucrats. They're your friends and neighbors. But it also reinforces to the people doing this work, the elected officials or the candidates, that their constituents aren't just adults. They're all the kids who are in those communities too. So it does two things to do that. Check your negativity when you can, because our kids get enough negative messages. If you have a new road that got paved, you can say, wow, I'm really glad we have this nice smooth road. That's something that government did. If you have a new park, if you have clean drinking water, if you have spaces to recreate, all of those things are points of positivity that you can work to counteract all the negativity that we know kids get in their daily diet of media and entertainment. There's 3 age bands that I talk about in the book, and I'll just tell you quickly how I think you should do this. Age 5 to 9, you're not quizzing them, you're not lecturing them, you're just giving them the positive impressions. You're building vocabulary. You're letting them hear what it is to talk about these things. They don't have to understand everything, but that's that base layer that you can scaffold on. Age 10 to 14, they can really start to grapple with some of these foundations and some of these concepts. Something that I like to do is if I have a candidate pool that I don't know anything about, I'll say like, you take 10 minutes, I'll take 10 minutes. Let's figure out what we think about these people. And your kids are going to go on different trajectories than you are. And so you'll get to see what research they did and compare it to your research. Age 15 to 18, you got to put it together. And by that, in the book, I go through 5 things that your kids need to know before they leave your house. They need to know how to register to vote. They need to know that there is a difference between a general election and a primary election, because in many places, the primary election is where the competition is. Your kids should have read the Constitution at least once before they've gotten out of high school. That doesn't happen on average. I just finished the Constitution with my college students right now, and only one of them had read it beginning to end prior to this class. You need to teach them a little bit about federalism. So who's doing what? Is it a state question? Is it a local question? Is it a federal question? And then you need to show them how to do hard conversations. What you're seeing on the right here is a QR code to the Instagram that I run for How to Raise a Citizen, where I talk about this and more, lots of politics stuff. If that's the sort of media that you like to use or like to ingest, I'd be happy to have you there. But I do want to say before taking your questions, I think that attention is the greatest form of generosity. And so thank you so much for being generous with me tonight. with your attention. And with that, I will welcome Charlene back to moderate our questions.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Lindsey Cormack. That was a very enlightening discussion. And parents who are on with us tonight, we can tell that you're interested too. So, Lindsey, question number one, you mentioned that even kids on a playground are doing politics. I don't think you're talking about Democrats and Republicans. Tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah, I mean, when they're deciding what sort of games we're going to play, like, are we going to play tag? Is it going to be Red Rover? This is collective decision making. Is it fair? Are you on my team? All those sorts of things are little versions of politics. It's like petty legalese or how we're figuring out what we're going to do. It's collective decision making. So they're practicing.
Okay, that I think is something that you could really start talking with kids very young about, right? We did social problem solving when I was teaching young children. 4-year-olds can problem solve like that.
Absolutely. And something that I do when I'm doing kids programming, when like really young people, is we'll set up this sort of game where I say, like, okay, we have 3 swings and 10 kids. How are we going to figure out who gets to use the swings? And they have a notion of fairness. Sometimes it's like you each get a few pushes or you each get a minute. And then you say, okay, but one of the kids was bullying this other kid yesterday. What do? They all have a sense of punishment. They say that kid gets to go last, or maybe they get fewer pushes. You say, oh, this kid's really sad because their goldfish died. Okay, then we have what accepting is. Maybe they get to go first or they get more pushes. They can sort of figure these things out and they have these notions in sort of their internal workings.
That's true. Even very young children have a real sense of rightness and fairness, don't they?
Yeah,
It's like they're hardwired for this kind of collaborative problem solving.
they are and they figure it out and sometimes they have slightly different approaches, but they are good at this. And they do sort of have a notion of fairness that's inborn to most children that I've gotten to work with.
Yeah. So again, Dr. Cormack, you talked to us about, oh, how many families do not have political conversations for whatever reason. So let's say you're a newbie, but you want to try it. How would you suggest opening that with your kids? Say you have a tween or a teen. How would you start it?
I think the best way to do it is to say, are you hearing about anything in school? Like, what is it that you're hearing about? Or what is it that you're hearing online? And something that I like to do is let them show me what they're seeing. Because you know how we're all sort of living in a different algorithmic media diet where what you're going to see is not what I'm going to see, was not what my 13-year-old's going to see. We have to like be willing to cross over and see some of the what we might think is silly or less serious things, because if we don't understand what they're interacting with, it's going to be hard for us to get into those political discussions, and sometimes they have to show us instead of tell us, but we should leave it open and let them sort of like guide that instead of saying like, let's have a discussion about this. Let them bring it to you or let them show you what they're hearing.
All right. So, what are you seeing and hearing about student government in schools? Is that still as big a deal as it used to be?
Student government is a really interesting, it's very interesting right now because I am very pro student government in the sense that like the idea that kids can have decision-making capacity in their own schools is great. However, in most of the student government sort of approaches that I am seeing is that the people who are doing it are well-intended kids who are tryhards and want to be there, but they've essentially been turned into glorified party planners, where it's like their job is they're going to throw the prom, or their job is they're going to throw the like fall ball or whatever that is, which is important. It is community oriented, it is community building, but it is not the student government that maybe you remember or I remember, my parents remember, which might be like petitioning to make it so that there's not styrofoam in the lunchroom, or figuring out some of these more consequential questions about like what testing should be like in the class. And so student government is great, and the kids who do it are really good. It is something that we as adults and administrators sometimes have a hard time giving over the reins for what actual power looks like, and instead we disempower them by showing them it's going to be something about a party.
Okay, fair enough. So that's something parents that you can look into how it's handled at your kids' own schools, right?
Definitely.
Okay, that's really interesting. All right. Traditionally in the United States, politics was kind of an in-person game, right? There were rallies and people get on trains and people give talks. What are parents supposed to do now, given how social media and AI are shaping the discourse? How should we help our kids differentiate between what's real and what's not?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question because it's something that I'm getting to confront a lot in the classroom at a tech school with college students, which is the idea of digital literacy or media literacy, I think, is at an inflection point or at the beginning of a really big shift that none of us know how it's going to turn out. It almost leads me to thinking that the in-person stuff is the experience that we should try to get our kids around because it's just getting so hard to detect what's real and what's not real. And I don't mean this in like the funny sort of like meme videos that get sent around where we know that it's comedy. There's plenty of things that are happening on totally legitimate platforms that are built by AIs that not are fooling people not maliciously, but are just fooling people because we can't really detect, is this a real conversation or is it not? And so I think it's important to ground what our expectations are in those in-person things when we're talking about like, how it is hard to sort of get our heads around what's happening in social media, I don't have a great answer other than to say it is hard and it's going to get harder, not easier. And that's why we have to show them what it is to do this in concert with other people, because other people are what our system is. And if we all individuate into just understanding what our little rectangle of a phone is saying to us, it's going to be hard to do things collectively.
So Lindsay, there's a question that's come in. It's an important one. So let's try. All right. The writer asks, how do you help teens who have layers of intersectionality talk about politics when they feel so much anxiety from seeing their identities attacked? My teen school does a great job supporting the conversations, but when they come home, they just feel anxious. They don't want to talk about it anymore. Their big feelings intensified by being teenagers.
Yes, this is a very good question. And you're right, it's an entirely important question. And whoever's asking this question, they're not alone in it. There's plenty of kids who are in this sort of place. The political climate across different parts of the country feel threatening to people personally. I think there's sort of three things that I would say to this. One is we have to validate and not minimize our kids' feelings on this. Now, we might say some of this feels more heightened because they're, at that time in their life where hormones are bigger and everything feels a little bit bigger than it is. But by letting your teen know that that anxiety makes sense, you might say something that's like, you're right, a lot of this feels scary. And I totally understand it if it's targeting people who look like you or people who look like your friends. That sort of validation is important because it allows them to feel sort of seen in that moment, but also reduces their pressure to defend their feelings. They don't have to justify why they feel this way. I think it's very important also then to sort of try to separate political noise from personal safety because these are different and they can feel the same. And so there's a difference between like rhetoric and policy, and there's a difference between like headlines and what your day-to-day life is going to be. And I think because, the teen brain is still developing and it's still sort of understanding what threats are real and what threats are not, sometimes they can equate cruel commentary or directed comments to them as immediate danger. And that is probably not the way we want them to feel because that's not a good way to go through life. And so we have to sort of grapple with these things to be like, personal safety is very important, emotional safety is very important, but let's not make these things bigger than they are because your brain is magnifying it. I also think I know I said I'd say three things, but I actually think there's sort of like four-ish things. One is if you can anchor your student in some sort of community or some sort of action, and that doesn't have to be explicitly political, but it usually has to be in person and local. So it could be a mutual aid organization, it could be some sort of reading club, it could be some sort of gardening club, but something that anchors them in community and repeated interaction that can be really helpful because it's sort of modeling what it is to be grounded and engaged on something, which helps counteract things that feel like threats to identity. And then the last thing that I'll say, I mean, I have a lot on this. I think this is an important question, but the last thing is we have to teach our kids media pacing. And that is really hard because I know that we're all stretched in a million different ways. I know we're all doing a million different things, but it is a really hard hole for a child's brain to get out of if it just keeps going deeper and deeper and deeper and can't get out of whatever scrolling is or that unlimited thing. And so we have to start talking about and teaching pacing, which can be stepping away, doing something else, hard limits, not phones in your bedroom, all these sorts of things to make it harder for our kids to sort of get sucked into stuff.
Thank you, Lindsay. That's good advice. So finally, I just have to ask, what gives you hope that today's young people can become more informed, engaged citizens than previous generations?
I have so much hope here. I have so
Yeah.
much hope here. I have a lot of joy around it too. Part of it is the real talk of like how low we are to begin with, which is like there's a lot of room to grow. There's a lot of stuff to learn. There's a lot of things that we can write. But the other thing that I'm really hopeful about is the students that I see they're not despondent. They're not like, there's nothing that's possible to change. They see things as possible, but they understand that they are like this deck is stacked against them. And because they're not giving up, because they seem to be like interested in learning more and doing more, I believe they will. I don't like the idea of us throwing the problems that we created as adults or that adults before us created onto them, but that is sort of the march of history, which is like you have to deal with the decisions that were made before you. And I think they're up to it because no one wants to live in a way where they think like the world is going to get worse, life is going to be worse, especially at a time when in many markers, life is very good. Life expectancy is good. Child life expectancy is good. Things generally are getting better in many metrics. And so if we can figure this politics thing out, or if we can make it a little bit better, I think a lot of those other things are going to feel better. And so I'm very hopeful that young people see that as a goal. And I think they're moving towards it, at least the ones that I get to interact with.
Well, listen, thank you, Professor Lindsey Cormack, for tonight, because I can tell by all the hearts and everything that the audience believes it too. We all have children and young children and grandchildren now that we want to do well, and you have inspired us tonight. So thank you, Lindsey, for everything. And take care, everybody. We hope to see you again soon. Stay on, answer that survey. But again, Dr. McCormick, thank you so much for a really brilliant conversation tonight.